It's morning in May of 1968. You pick up the paper and head to the kitchen to read it. The front page headline stretches across the fold, heavy and certain. Readers like you see the appearance of a straightforward article authored by a typical journalist. But behind that headline sits another author, the Central Intelligence Agency. The agency had a name for this maneuver, prop play, a planted story shaped to look like an ordinary article or report, while serving as an intelligence objective. It was logged under MH-SPAN, the cryptonym for the CIA's program for covert propaganda. The placement was deliberate and timed to coincide with the arrival of a Soviet diplomat in Bogota, turning the news cycle into an instrument of policy. The craft here is narrative, selecting details, guiding emphasis, and hiding intent under the cadence of routine reporting. And the fact that it existed won't come to light until years later. This is the kind of story we unpack on Mimi Leaks, high-profile events examined through primary sources. And today, we'll track how, in 1968, the CIA seeded a cluster of headlines, or prop plays, across Colombian newspapers to shape Cold War perception and counter Soviet influence. Stories like this matter today because false narratives, political spin, and even outright disinformation still shape how we see the world. What's different now is the speed and the scale. Stories can spread globally in minutes, shaping perception before facts can catch up. The stakes feel higher because the tools of influence are in everyone's pocket. Before we start, please like and subscribe. It helps me deliver carefully sourced explainers on the forces behind the stories you thought you knew and the ones you didn't know were there. The 1960s in Latin America ran hot with coups, revolutions, and foreign interventions from Havana to Santiago. Colombia was one chapter in the wider struggle over ideology and influence. Paramilitary and guerrilla groups expanded. Campuses filled with marches and teach-ins. Unions staged strikes. Bogota's plazas carried the energy of a country in flux, and newspapers reflected the turbulence in daily headlines. Washington read this environment as ripe terrain. Embassy dispatches flagged student groups trending towards Marxist ideas. CIA reporting tracked Soviet cultural centers and Cuban networks as channels of influence. Colombia didn't have a diplomatic relationship with the Soviet Union for 2 decades. In 1968, ties were restored, right as headlines linked Soviet support to local revolutionary groups. A planted headline could travel through cafes, classrooms, and government offices, not necessarily even to persuade everyone, but to circulate it until it felt ambient. The timing aligned with the new Soviet ambassador's arrival in Bogota and with a regional focus on Nikolai Leonov, a veteran Soviet intelligence officer under diplomatic cover in Mexico City. Leonov was based in Mexico City, a Cold War crossroads where Soviet and Cuban intelligence officers operated under diplomatic cover and met with Latin America party contacts. The CIA already knew Leonov was a KGB officer in Mexico City with a history of working through Communist Party channels. The objective was to link money and guidance to identifiable actors and let the press carry the inference. Picture the backdrop: unrest and diplomacy, a press with outsized weight, a public primed for narrative, and an intelligence service looking for openings. That's the stage on which the prop play, or a series of them perhaps, would unfold, bending existing currents toward a strategic outcome. In April of 1968, surveillance in Mexico City tied Nikolai Leonov to a cash handoff to Feliciano Pachon and an associate. Pachon was identified in CIA reporting as a senior Communist Party organizer with ties to an emerging insurgency. Colombian authorities detained the pair on return and seized more than $100,000, along with leads that helped map clandestine networks tied to the Colombian Communist Party and a budding Marxist guerrilla group known as FARC, or FARC. That arrest gave the Bogota station the raw material for its prop play, a chance to frame the story as proof of a Soviet-backed subversive network stretching from Mexico to Colombia. Cables described Soviet diplomats oozing sweetness, good fellowship, and non-interference upon their diplomatic return. This was juxtaposed with press coverage implicating them with secret operations and corruption. Additionally, early reporting in Bogota dailies blurred details and contradicted itself. Some of that confusion came from fragments the CIA itself had circulated as background, giving the agency room to steer the narrative. Amid that confusion, the station fed select elements that pointed towards a regional subversive network spanning Colombia, Bolivia, Mexico, and Venezuela, and linked the arrests to subsequent roll-ups of party leadership. El Tiempo, the nation's leading newspaper and the most influential daily among Colombia's political class, then ran a coherent story centered on Pachón. The arrests and the seized cash were genuine, that it was a Soviet pipeline to Colombian guerrillas, that was the crafted narrative rather than a proven fact. It presented the cash as Soviet-connected and destined for guerrillas. Bogota dailies carried related items, seeded to echo the same themes, and regional papers amplified them. While the CIA ran its operation in the press, Colombian law enforcement ran a series of raids on underground infrastructure aligned with Communist Party cells and allied networks. It turned out those raids were as a result of the leads confiscated during the arrest of Pachón and his associate from earlier that year. The leads consisted of seized notes and testimony that pointed authorities toward the party's hidden infrastructure. What began as a cash-laden stop at customs cascaded into a wider sweep that exposed the underground press, and police seized printing machines, stacks of pamphlets, and forged passports, the kit of a parallel press operating beneath official channels. The seized inventory illustrates capacity. Printing machines could flood neighborhoods overnight with fresh broadsheets. Pamphlets carried political tracts, union manifestos, and guerrilla communiques designed to rally support and explain ideology. Forged passports and identity papers enabled couriers to move across borders, carrying both messages and money. As public headlines were being shaped in the spring through CIA-guided prop play, this hidden press carried its own narratives into circulation. Pamphlets and underground newspapers were likely distributed in working-class barrios on university campuses and through labor networks and spaces where official dailies like El Tiempo had less reach. In effect, two information streams running in parallel, one overt, one clandestine, each competing to define events. Even as Colombian authorities dismantled safe houses, the CIA kept its eye on the narrative. The Bogota station reported La República and El Siglo published articles May 17, 1969, which framed Leonov as the mastermind behind Soviet support for communist parties in Latin America. Yet, pushing the campaign would risk exposing GISOY-92, a sensitive insider with access to government deliberations. Protecting that asset took priority, and by 1970, the cables shift to other operations, and the record no longer shows new insertions in the prop play campaign. The placement had been achieved. Leonov's name and the Soviet connection were firmly planted in the Colombian press. But what was the impact? For President Lleras, the case was described inside CIA traffic as a difficult political pill. His government needed U.S. aid and intelligence support, but also needed to avoid the appearance of being pulled into Washington's Cold War contests. Thankfully for Colombian officials, they acknowledged the arrests but avoided amplifying the narrative, and by doing so, resisted the optics of being cast as a proxy. As for Soviet relations, sure, the CIA managed to successfully plant stories that resulted in a lot of confusion, but the political payoff stayed limited. In 1976, Colombia and the Soviet Union signed the Commercial Cooperation Treaty, which aimed at expanding trade, scientific, and educational exchanges between the two countries. In other words, the headlines may have stung, but they didn't derail Moscow's agenda. Overall, the propaganda play left a paper trail of headlines, but not the decisive shift in Colombia's political landscape that the CIA likely hoped for. The cables from Bogota are more than Cold War artifacts. They read like early blueprints for something we still live with, the shaping of public opinion through planted stories, timed leaks, and narrative control. Because history doesn't just repeat, it adapts. Governments, corporations, online networks, and other actors, whether in competition or coordination, insert their version of events into the public stream. Back then, The CIA called it a prop play. Today, the language is different. Spin, messaging strategy, information warfare, fake news. In current times, a foreign actor might run coordinated special media campaigns to sow division and distort public perception. The tools are faster, the reach is wider, but the logic remains. If a story circulates, it can considerably shape beliefs. The Bogota case shows how influence operations rarely end with a single headline. Some flicker out while others embed quietly into the background noise of daily life. The immediate impact fell short of what the CIA hoped, yet covert propaganda is designed to blur cause and effect. Its influence may have lingered in ways impossible to prove, precisely because the public never realized it was being shaped. Half a century later, the lesson holds. Information is contested ground. What changed is the speed, the scale, and the platforms. The question isn't whether influence operations exist, it's whether we can spot them before they settle in. Do you think the CIA or a foreign government's use of press assets is justified? What's your strategy for spotting similar operations in your media diet? Did anything here feel familiar to you? If you have any thoughts, feel free to partake in civil discourse and share your take below. Please take a moment to like or subscribe the channel. It helps signal what you want more of. Thank you so much for watching. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and always consider who benefits from a particular given news piece or story.